In this video, I intend to respond. Normally, what I've been doing with these weekend catch-ups, and this is not weekend, of course, this is Monday. I should have done this yesterday or Saturday, but I was busy. What I normally do is to try and see what the chapters that had been covered between Monday and Friday or Monday and Saturday and try to do a recap on them. But again, I thought it would be very helpful if I could get direct questions from people to respond to as people are reading through the book, Living by the Book by Howard Hendricks. So in the course of last week, 2 questions stood out. One is about Bible translations. The other is about time. If you want to do all these things that we're saying, approaching personal Bible study, how do you find the time and balance the time to do all that? So those are the 2 things that I will be speaking about. Okay, so I want to start with the Bible translations one, and that's actually the one I will dwell on. And I've prepared a slide which I've used for the church congregation I work with here in Liverpool before to discuss some of these things with them. So it's easy for me to just pull that up and share the same with us. So by way of introduction, one of the most asked questions about the Bible is, what's the best translation? And that's kind of the question I picked from one of the 2 WhatsApp groups of AMG because of last week. What are the 2, what's the best translation for each person? And people have already responded to that on the group. I just thought to give a holistic view about it. And the simple answer is it all depends on who you are and what you want to do part-time with the Bible. It's not every time that we engage in personal Bible study. We use the Bible for all sorts of things. And then who are you as a person? So those are the 2 major factors that would play into deciding what version to use part-time. Many people find that they need more than one Bible and they use different ones for different occasions, like myself. There are quite a number of Bibles on my shelf around there. But I use different ones part-time. And these days, I even tend to use more of electronic Bibles. And I probably would show what that could also look like for those that might want to explore that a bit. It can help to know a few basic facts about translations generally before you settle down for 1 or 2, as the case may be. And the first thing to know is that there are broadly 2 types of, thanks for putting on your video. There are broadly 2 types of translations. There is one that we call formal equivalence, and there is another one called dynamic equivalence, but those are big terms. The easy way to say it is there are translations that are word for word, and there are translations that are thought for thought. By word for word, we mean, of course, we know the Bible is broadly written in 2.5 languages, 3 languages actually, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Some parts of the Old Testament were written in Aramaic, but bulk of it was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is majorly written in Greek. And so from the manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, the Aramaic manuscripts, people translate into different languages. And so we have all sorts of English Bible translations. Even in my mother tongue, Yoruba, there are all sorts of, at least about 3-4 different Yoruba translations that are available at the moment that I'm aware of on the U version, and more like that. So, but all of these translations basically fall under these 2 big categories. It's either word for word or it's thought for thought. And by word for word, what that means is it gives priority to what the original language says and how it says it. The aim is to be as literal as possible. So if, for instance, you want to translate this statement, I am a boy, which I've just said in English. If you want to translate it to whatever language you are speaking apart from English, like your mother tongue, if you are from outside of the British Isles, what you would do with a word for word translation is you want to get exactly an equivalent for each of those words. Hi, then you say that in your language. Ham, you say that in your language. A, you say that in your language. Boy, you say that in your language. So at the end of the day, what you would have is usually almost the same number of words that you will find in the literal, in the original language that the thing was spoken in. So that's what happens with most of word for word translations. They are trying as much as possible to say, let's preserve the exact way the words were joined together phrased together in the original translation. The thought-for-thought translation, on the other hand, what it does is basically, you could call it phrase by phrase. It takes a statement and tries to bring that statement into this context that you are the translator. You are bringing it into your context, understanding the statement, and then saying it the way that you think people will say it in your own language. And so a good example of that, for instance, would be where Bible says, I am the bread of life. Bread in that context is a very common food, but imagine you're translating the Bible into a language where people don't eat bread. The essence of saying I am the bread of life will be defeated. So someone that is doing a phrase by phrase translation can look at bread in that context and try to see what food serves almost the same purpose as bread in this culture or in this context. For instance, if you want to translate that to Ijeshas, which is the part of southwestern Nigeria that I come from, you could say something like, I am the pounded yam of life, because pounded yam is like their go-to meal. They could eat pounded yam morning, afternoon, night. And so that's part of what thought-for-thought translation does. But the problem with that, not the problem, the unique thing with that is you're already interpreting the text. You're already taking what was said in the original, translating it, interpreting it, and making that interpretation a translation. So there is a lot of things that come into play in doing that. Your personal preference comes into play, your cultural background comes into play, the way you understand things come into play. So there are so many things that are shaping how thought-for-thought translations are made. Or you can call them phrase-for-phrase translation. So they are less concerned with the grammatical form of the original language. They are more concerned with the meaning of the original language, and then they translate that. And it gives a lot of room, like I said, for interpretation, and they are usually easier to understand. So a word-for-word translation is impossible much or most of the time, because again, if you want to do word for word, literally, there are times that you would end up with a statement that just doesn't make sense. If I say in English that someone kicked the bucket, and you want to interpret that to any other language, Yoruba, for instance, those are my two languages. Sorry, I'm going back to Yoruba. But if you want to interpret, someone kicked the bucket, we know that is an idiomatic expression in the English for someone that's died. So if you say kicked the bucket, literally like that in the Yoruba language, it means kick the bucket. And kick the bucket will then lose the meaning that it means in the English. So it's always almost impossible to actually do a word-for-word translation, even when the people that are making a translation are choosing to stick as much as possible with the literal sense. So for a good example would be every time you see in the KJV, you see something like God was angry with the Israelites. In the Hebrew, if you want to take it word for word, oftentimes the imagery that is used is that the nostrils of God was enlarged. Number one, God doesn't have nose. God is a spirit. And they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So it's not about whether God has got nostrils or not. That is an idiom to describe something. But what is describing? It's describing a God that is hungry. So an enlarged nose in that sense is talking about anger. And so you won't find God's nostrils were enlarged in the KJV. You'll find God was angry with the Israelites and things like that. So that's an example. So even in a word-for-word translation, basically the point I'm making here is they still have to wrestle with some things whereby they have to make some allowances, make some interpretation, as it were, before they can also put it in a word-for-word format as much as possible. So the tension for every translation that is faithful to the original, generally for all translations, is they want to either decide, do we want to be faithful to the original form or faithful to the original meaning? Do we want to be faithful to how it was said in Hebrew, in Greek, in Aramaic, or do we want to be faithful to what it meant to them and communicate that in our own way to our own audience of today, how it will sound in their ears? So sometimes faithfulness to one would mean that you won't be too faithful to the other. So for instance, the KJV doesn't always make sense, even grammatically. In John chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, the thief cometh not but for to steal, to kill, to destroy, but I am come. Nobody says I am come these days. That's bad English. but that's them trying to stay faithful to exactly the words that were used in the Greek translation in that instance. So that's the tension. On the side of that is that if you're doing a thought for thought translation, there is also the possibility that you will interpret things too much and then end up with something that actually may have lost the original intention of what was said. Lydia, did you say something? Okay, I thought you were trying to chip in something at that point. Okay, so that's the main tension. Should we stay faithful to the form in which it was in the original, or should we stay faithful to the meaning? Some few thoughts about KJV, because I know that KJV is like been around for quite a while. It's been the go-to Bible for very many people. It's the Bible many of us in the Christian church in Nigeria grew up knowing. But the point is, as grand as KJV is, as wonderful as it is, I saw a documentary about how it was made years back. It was titled When God Spoke English or something like that. It's a very lovely documentary about the KJV and very informative. And it's not all good information, actually. But the point is, between then and now, between 1611 and now, the KJV of today that we have now, it's gone through 3 revisions. They've made about 100,000 changes, and there would be the need to continue to make changes because languages evolve. Even the English language has been evolving and keeps evolving. Much of the evidence from new manuscripts. So this is another thing about the KJV. The Bible as a whole, of course, we know that when we say original manuscript, the point is people keep discovering more and more older manuscripts. The closer manuscript is to the original times that the events occurred, the more tendency that that particular manuscript will be more authentic. I mean, that makes sense. If something happened in the 1st century and you have a manuscript from the 1st century, then that would be a very accurate manuscript, as opposed to a manuscript that is dated the 3rd century. That's about 200 years after the event has happened. And so there's every tendency that in the process of copying and copying, these were days when there were no printers, these were days when there were no typewriters, people had to copy by their hand. So in the process of copying and recopying, there will probably be a little omission and error here and there. So there are more in recent times, at least in the 40s, in the 50s, and I think even quite lately, in the past few decades, there have been discoveries of very old manuscripts that were really closer to the times when many of these things happened, and they've not been incorporated into the KJV, basically. So it was translated from later manuscripts, and therefore there is the possibility of having some less accuracy in some passages. But by and large, KJV still remains a very good translation. They've tried to incorporate a lot of changes and made what they call the New King James Version, which is equally very good and reads a lot better grammatically. And there are many other translations that I've listed there. But here is a chart that kind of shows the blend, starting from those that are very literal. Those are the word-for-word ones, if you get what I mean. They are more word-for-word, up onto the ones that are more paraphrased, more thoughts for thoughts, starting from Young's literal translation, which is very literal. Young's was so literal to the point that he retained the sense in which the Hebrew people understand tenses. So for instance, in the Hebrew language, there is no future tense. All you have is past and present. If they want to tell you something that will happen in the Hebrew, oftentimes something that will happen in the future, they say it in the past in a way that the hearer understands that this thing sounds settled, even though it's yet to materialize. I don't know if that makes sense. An example would be many of the things that we see as promises in the Old Testament. For instance, when the Bible says in Obadiah 1:17, upon Zion there will be deliverance, and the sons of Jacob shall possess their possession, as though that's a future thing. In Young's translation, you will find there is deliverance, and the sons of Jacob have possessed their possession, because that's actually how it sounds in the Greek, even though it's supposed to be a prophecy. But in the Hebrew, rather, not the Greek. In the Hebrew language, they don't have a future tense, and you will never find a future tense in Young's literal translation of the Old Testament. So that's a very word-for-word translation. Up to some versions like KJV, NKJV, RSV, and then in between the likes of NIV, New Century Version, International Children's Bible, those ones try to blend the two approaches together. They try to blend a word-for-word approach and a thought-for-thought approach. So in some cases, they still read like the literal original manuscripts. In some other cases, they still read like contemporary English that had been interpreted to suit our day. But when you then move on to versions like New Living Translation or the Phillips translation, which is just for the New Testament, or contemporary English version, the Living Bible, the Message, you are getting to points where it's basically phrase for phrase. They are, in fact, what Eugene Peterson did with the Message was basically to take sometimes even a chunk of a paragraph, which could be like 6-7 verses, and read that in the original manuscript, bring it to contemporary English and paraphrase everything. And that's why sometimes it's difficult in the Message to locate exactly what verse you are looking for. You will see that some verses are lumped together or matched together. That's because it's paraphrasing. And sometimes in paraphrasing, you might need to rearrange the thoughts or the sentences in doing that. So that's the wide range of translations. And this chart covers a whole lot of them. So the question then comes to, how do you want to use the Bible? For you to decide for yourself what translation you need to use. And I will cite a few possibilities. If you are new to the Bible, if this is you wanting to fall in love with the Bible, you've not been reading the Bible as such before, the advice would be to go for a thought-for-thought translation. So I'm talking of the likes of New Living Translation, Contemporary English Version, versions like the Living Bible, TLB, versions like the Message. It helps you to at least understand the gist of the Bible. It helps you to understand the gist of what you're reading in the language that you understand, which has been written in simple contemporary English for your understanding. If you're new to the Bible, what if you want to read the Bible aloud? There are times where in some church services in their ecclesiology, there is actually a section of the service that is devoted to scripture reading. Stands on the pulpit and reads the Bible. If you want to do that, it's always better to get a version that is a blend of both approaches, a version that blends word for word, thought for thought. A good example would be NIV or the New Reserved Standard Version, NRSV. Those two versions are a blend of both. They've written them in a way that is supposed to read well to the ears. It's supposed to be clear. It's good English. It's understandable English. The third use will be if you are reading with other people. So for instance, like in a study group, and you want to decide which will work best for you, it might be better to use, to agree together on a particular version that you want to use for the purpose that you want to use it. And that way it helps everyone to be on the same page, depending on what kind of study you're doing. Some other times it might actually also be good for different people to use different translations so that when you come together to discuss it, you can come with different shades of meaning about what you're reading and discussing. A fourth use might be if you want to study a passage in depth, you want to really go deep into the text. To do that, you need a word-for-word translation. Many of the things we're learning in the book will work best if you are reading from a word-for-word translation. So for instance, if you are looking for keywords, you are looking for root words that you will then have to go and find out what's the Greek meaning of this word, how is it used, what's the Hebrew meaning of this word. If you are using a phrase-by-phrase translation, there is every tendency that they would have used another word entirely that is not even exactly what was used in the original languages in a bid to find what works best. Lydia, I'm the one that muted you because there's like a sound that is coming from that side that's making a sound. So it's okay. If you need to say something, you can wave your hands, then I'll unmute you and then you speak. That's if you want to study the passage in depth, you need a word for word. So I'm talking of the likes of KJV, NASB. I've heard that ESV is also very good in that regards. I've not really used ESV myself, but yes. And then the fifth use would be if you will be reading big sections at a time. So for instance, if you are following a Bible reading plan, then it might be good to also go for a translation that focuses more on thought for thought. Last year when I tried reading the Bible through, I didn't get to do that eventually. And I'll touch on that in the next second question very briefly. But when I tried to do that, I went for the message translation, basically because I've done that before. I've read the Bible through before, but in different other versions. So I like to, every time I want to do it again, I like to do it in another translation and just see things that see some other things in a new light. And lastly, if you want to get a sense of how complex a passage is, so you're studying a particular verse or a particular passage, 2-3 verses, or you're studying a chapter, and you really want to see, you want to wrestle with the issues that are jumping at you, and you're wondering, is this just a matter of the translation that I'm reading, or is that actually what's going on in the text? Then you might need to compare different translations. And a site I readily use for that is Bible Gateway. So I'll just quickly show you what that could look like. For instance, if you want to study John 10:10, where Jesus says, the thief cometh not but for to steal, to kill, to destroy. I've come that they might have life. There is this small button here that says John 10:10 in all English translations. And then it lists out that verse in as many translations as they have for that particular verse in English. And this is over, I think it's over 50 different translations in the English language. So that's a very good resource to use, Bible Gateway. You could also limit it to just a few, translations that you compare side by side. So you have your NKJV here, you have your whatever version you want to choose, God's Word translation, for instance. And you could go on and on like that to have up to 5 of those listed next to each other. So that's about translations. But in general, the point is you should pick a version that helps you the most based on what you want to use the Bible for at that point in time. And I like the contribution someone gave on the group, on one of the AMG groups about this, that there is always a Bible translation that speaks your love language. There's a Bible translation that you discover that you read it and you fall in love with the way the words were coined. It's always good to go for that kind of translation as your go-to translation. For me, in recent times, that's the Passion Translation. The only problem is it's still a project. The Passion Translation has all of the New Testament, has Psalms, Proverbs, Songs of Solomon, Isaiah, but that's all about it. So they are still working on the bulk of the Old Testament. It's not yet a complete Bible volume. But again, I love the interpretation approach that the man has used, and where he has done, where he has rephrased things in a way that sounds too drastically different from what you will find in most other Bible translations. He will give a footnote to explain why he has settled, because he decided to go for a different manuscript at that point in time. It could be because he's trying to reword everything in a way, and then it gives you an alternative reading or an alternative rendering in the footnotes for you to catch up with what it could also sound like or what it could also mean. So generally, that's thereabouts what I have to say about translations. Every Bible translation, I believe, is good as long as it's indeed the Bible and not something else. One last thing that I might thought to also mention is to want to see how many people worked on a translation. The Message translation was worked on basically by Eugene Peterson. The Living Bible was worked on basically by one major person. Of course, they all have editors. But Bible translations like KJV, like NIV, like NRSV, these were done by a team of scholars, a team of different people coming. There is also every tendency that in the multitude of counsel, if you are looking for faithfulness to the context, you will find that in translations that are authored by more than one person. Usually when it is just one person, you can decide to interpret things any which way. Eugene was saying that when he was working on Matthew chapter 5, for instance, he wanted to, in the original, in his first draft, where Matthew 5 is the Beatitudes, blessed are they that, blessed are they that. In his initial interpretation of that passage, he went for, lucky are you when this happens, lucky are you when that happens. And when they asked him, why did you settle for lucky in this particular passage? He said it's because there was a very sweet lady that was a part of a congregation that he has pastored that likes saying that, oh, you are so lucky, just because of that experience and the context in which the woman uses it. He decided to bring that into a Bible translation Why? Because of course it's the one interpreting it. You can do and undo with it. So that's the risk. Of course, the editors eventually said, no, we don't think that would work here. And I think he went on to settle for maybe happy are you when and happy are you when or something like that. So I just thought to keep that in as well. Lastly, there's another question about the point of observation, interpretation, application. We said that's how to study the Bible effectively. And indeed, it's going to take time. So someone from Canada is asking, I have a concern about how this approach to studying the Bible can help us, especially adults, given that time is an issue for most of us. So the time to first consider particular words, to consider the genre of the book, the history of the book you're reading, the relational meanings and all that, it might not be practicable. I know you would say that we should create the time when you really want to, but I would just like us to consider that constraint for a bit. And I like that question because it speaks into, to some extent, the reality that I am also going through now as a face in our family life with two young boys working from home, and you could hardly have some breathing space. The only reason I could do this now is because my wife is the one pleasantly suffering with the two of them upstairs. Otherwise, I'm running after one boy or doing something else or taking somebody that is going into the toilet in the midst of doing many other things that I've got to do working from home. So indeed, how do you do personal Bible study when you don't have time, when it seems like you don't have time? And I've decided to think through that in 3 points. The first is priority. And that's the point to say that it's not that we don't have time. Again, just like the man rightly mentioned from, I think, chapter 1, when he was trying to see why people don't do this. It's a question of priority, really. If it is germane in your heart, you will make time. Make time doesn't mean you sit down and everywhere. It's not a perfect setting. It usually won't be perfect. Last week, Friday or Saturday, I think it was on Saturday, my wife spent most of the day with an open Bible somewhere and still doing many other things that she has to do and still coming back with both boys clamoring for attention and all that. And she was reading the book of the month and trying to apply what she was reading and talking aloud sometimes and soliloquizing some other times. In the midst of all that, she got something. And she was hoping to do that again today. She planned to take today off, but eventually it wasn't approved. So she's working her way around that now and all that. Basically, the point is, no matter how busy we are, if it's in your mind, if it's in your plan to do it, you get a way to do it. It's not going to look like you sitting down and clearing 2 hours, which you don't have, to sit down with commentaries and the internet and your notepad and everything. For very many of us, what that looks like, for me, for instance, what that looks like could just be churning on a verse of the Bible for 2 weeks. And that doesn't have to involve me sitting down. My toilet moment, oftentimes Bible study times, I go on the internet while I'm in the toilet studying a particular word that I'm trying to ponder on and squeeze the juice out of and things like that. So it could look like the question of priority. The second one is reality. Reality in the sense that, of course, when it is realistically impossible, don't beat yourself up. Don't condemn yourself. It's not about guilt. It's all about it's about the heart, the attitude. God is and knows that it's just impracticable for now. And so when there is no time, realistically speaking, don't beat yourself up. Continue to fellowship with the Spirit. Continue to keep in touch, praying and talking to God and talking about that as well with God. I wish I had more time to do this, to do that. He probably would have some ideas to share with you. Because at the end of the day, and that's the last point, it's all about relationship. That's the ultimate goal. It's all about you deeper, more intimate with your Savior. And it's not until you are able to consistently open up some 2 hours that you want to study the Bible personally every single day, that will turn into something else. But understanding that this is a relationship. And like I said, for me, for the most part of the last couple of years, what serious Bible study looks like, apart from when I have to do things like this or prepare for sermon and I really have to withdraw from the kids and my wife has to be the one to watch them over that period of time. Other times, what that looks like really is just studying on verses over a period of time and just thinking through them and just hearing and speaking and talking to God about the things that I'm reading and learning. This has been more than long, so I'm going to stop now. And yeah, this will be on the groups as audio and as video for people that might want to catch up with it. Thanks for sending in your questions and for reading the book and engaging with the content. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to send them in, be it on any of the platforms, and we'll pick up on them and feed back on them in the next video that we'll do. God bless you all. Take care of yourselves. Bye.